Climate change is the development challenge of our times, both in the world and maybe in particular, as you will see from this presentation, in the Arab countries. Climate change is a threat to the poverty reduction and economic growth that we have heard in earlier presentations today that have been taking place. And this is particularly so in the Arab countries. It may reverse all the gains in terms of poverty reduction, inclusion, etc., that the region has achieved over the last decades. This calls for action. We need to act now, we need to act together, and we need to act differently, said the World Millennium Report from 2010, loud and clearly. So this is our starting point. We know that we need to take action in the world as a whole. So how do we need to do it in the Arab world? But before going into what action is needed, I'd like to outline a little bit to you what are the climate change threats that the region is facing, some of the impacts, and then come with some draft solution. I will bring a caveat right from the front. This is ongoing work. This is highly participatory, and I have a lot of friends that have taught me, and I see as my masters sitting in this room that have guided me when we started, had contributed in terms of written materials as we have been going on. And before I forget them, I would like to acknowledge Hamid Afsef sitting here that drafted the water chapter. Clemens, I don't know where you're sitting now, but you have been fantastic in helping us all the computational work and the impact in some countries. Rami, I cannot see you, but you cannot hide. We also want to thank you for all your great contribution, particularly in terms of making sure that the poor people in the Arab countries are included in this study. The motivation for the study is pretty much straightforward for you that know the region, but I've only worked in the region for 2 years, so maybe bear with me because it's probably pretty basic. The motivation are the current and projected climate change and variability in the Arab countries. Plus, we should not forget, as we've heard earlier on, there's a number of other stresses because climate change is not the only issue the region is dealing with. There's increased population growth, there's high rate of urbanization taking place, people are leaving rural areas and moving to the urban settlements and coasts, and then there's a problem with the quality of education, as we have heard, and so on and so forth. All these increase vulnerability in the Arab countries. So this calls for action now. This calls for climate change adaptation to reduce the negative impacts and build climate resilience in the Arab countries. Not only that, but also in the regions, in the countries, and in the communities, as we will learn that climate change impacts are highly differentiated on a number of levels, starting with at the geographical level. But also, as Clement very clearly said in his presentation this morning, not all households can adapt in a similar way given the resources, etc. But also there's some impacts within the household that we should not forget about. So this report provides information on climate change and its consequences in the Arab countries, and we do an attempt to provide practical guidelines on adaptation for policymakers. And all its policymakers for us in this report are really all of us sitting in this room, plus people working in government, plus the civil society, and even the community leaders. We are all in this. We all have to give a hand because the problems are so large. Some of them are pretty big right now, but after this presentation you might walk away being a bit shocked of how dire the future is likely to look based on the IPCC and the other big calculations that climate models have been doing in the last years. Why are we doing this report? First of all, based on consultation with a number of you and also with governments in the region, there was a big need to have a report for the Arab countries. The IPCC, as you know, split the Arab region in two parts. In Africa, with North Africa and the Maghreb countries, and then West Asia has the countries in the Arabian Peninsula. And also, if you read it from a policymaker sitting in the Arab countries, you might feel that your country is actually not covered very well, because if you're an Arab African country, you are likely to feel that you're not getting enough attention because everything is said about sub-Saharan Africa. And if you're reading in the Asian chapters to find information about the Arabian Peninsula, you also feel that it might be a little bit too much about maybe Bangladesh and the Ganges in the IPPC report. So this is trying to fill this gap and move it a bit ahead. Moreover, we have 5 IPPC authors as part of the team, meaning that we are able to make sure that all the information we're producing here is likely to feed into the AR5 report that comes out in 2014. It's getting drier, warmer, and more variable. And climate change is happening now. Already in 2010, of a large number of countries over the world measured the highest temperature on record. And 5 out of the 6 highest temperatures in the world was measured in an Arab country. Kuwait measured 52.6 degrees Celsius. Means that if you add 5 degrees by the end of the century, as IPPC's prediction, to this, you can do the math. It's going to be pretty warm. And if you think of the people that have to have a livelihood working in these very hot summers, it's going to be tough. And not even to think of all the guest workers that are working in construction that have to be outdoor. Also, the Arabian Sea experienced the 2nd strongest tropical cyclone on record in 2010. And that had a huge impact, for example, in Oman, where more than 40 people died and wrecked the economy for something like $700 million. The coral reefs in the Red Sea, for example, took the 2nd worst beating because of the record summer ocean water temperature. And this is all threatening livelihoods and well-being of the people in the Arab countries. In the recent decade, temperatures have increased by 0.2 to 0.3 degrees Celsius per decade. And we have seen more frequent and intense heat waves in the region. But we've also seen less rainfall. But when the rain has actually fallen, it has been more intense. And we have had more frequent flooding and droughts than we have seen previously. Again, it's threatening people, livelihoods, and well-being in the Arab countries. Future will also get warmer, drier, and more variable. We're talking about 0.4 degrees Celsius increase per decade. This is 50% higher than the global average. And the most of North Africa and Eastern Mediterranean will also become drier. A few countries that it's not completely clear what will happen. It could get a bit wetter, like Yemen, Sudan, and Somalia. But overall, the Arab region will get very much drier. And we're also seeing more variability, as I mentioned, the drought and the floods, and more extremes as we go along. So, as I mentioned, climate change is impacting people's lives and livelihoods. And we should not forget that it's impacting the poor people the hardest, because they're most dependent on natural resources for their livelihoods and their well-being. But people have coped with harsh environment for thousands of years in the Arab countries. Already 4,000 years ago, a temporary climate shift created 300 years of droughts and reduced rainfall, colder temperatures in the northeast Syria, which meant that there was a shift from agriculture into pastoralism. With climate change on top of this harsh environment that people have been coping with for thousands of years, people feel that their coping mechanisms are not always easy to employ anymore, and many times even inadequate. This is why we're doing this report. And as this little Bedouin boy that has lost everything, his family has lost everything, and they're squatted outside Palmyra in Syria, he has a lot of hope for pulling this work together, because he honestly said to us that he thinks the future is going to get better. Climate change has large, short, and long-term welfare reduction implications. As I mentioned, temperatures are increasing, and so precipitation is likely to be reduced. Based on the CGE models that we have been working with IFPRI, We have come up with calculations that show that by 2050, Syria is likely to have a reduction in household income by up to $3.4 billion. Yemen, but close to $6 billion. Droughts, as I mentioned, getting more frequent. The droughts in Syria, for example, we have calculated is reducing GDP by 1 percentage point every year in a drought year compared to a non-drought year. And we should not forget that poverty is also being increased in these drought years. And the calculation shows that poverty is going up by 1.4, up to 1.4 percentage point in a drought year. And again, you know, as we've talked about a lot this morning, food security is already a significant problem, and climate change is likely to add to that. And again, the poor is hit the hardest. I'm not going to get more into that. We have heard that before. So let's talk about a few of the things that we haven't talked so much about until now in this great conference. Clement, you're coming in late. I have talked about you. I have thanked you, but welcome. Climate change reduces the availability of already overexploited water resources. By 2050, the region will likely face a 10% reduction in runoff due to the climate change. And we should not forget that already today there's a 16% renewable water supply gap. And by 2050, it's likely to go up to 50%. The rural poor population are the most vulnerable to climate change. We should not forget that 70% of the poorest people in the Arab country live in rural areas. So the climate change is adding to their vulnerability. As we have heard already, that agricultural output could be decreased, and some of the work that we have found up to 40% by 2080. Climate change can stress the local food production systems and call for increased import, as we've heard about. And then, as Clement and some of the other presenters have said today, we should not forget the safety net. The social safety nets are key. It has proven so in other arid parts of the world, such as in northeast of Brazil. So this is something that we do need to bring on. Climate change is also associated with the rapid urbanization of people and rapid urbanization in the Arab countries. People and assets settle in vulnerable areas along the 37,000 kilometers coastline of the Arab countries. Some settle in areas that are pretty risky, where they don't have access to basic services, and the residents of rather informal settlements, for example, on slopes. So, as you know, when there's a hard rainfall coming down, some of these houses might get destroyed, but we should not forget, when poor people's houses are getting destroyed, many times it also affects their livelihoods for a large number of years, because a large share, and in some cases even up to 50% of the household income, is actually generated in the house. So the house is destroyed, assets are being destroyed, livelihoods for a long time are also being severely affected. We should not forget that both youth, men and women, are important stakeholders in climate change adaptation, and they're important agents of change. But we should not forget that climate change actually affects men and women differently because of the different roles. For example, women are often responsible for the natural resources of the household management, such as fetching water. And we know from Yemen, for example, that travel time for many rural women have increased dramatically. And we're hearing stories now that some women travel 7 hours a day to fetch the water. Of course, that takes time away for other productive activities for that particular person and household. And women also in the Arab countries have limited participation in the decision-making process. And again, if we refer to Yemen, if men that are actually leaving to work abroad, they might actually be leaving a household only with women behind, so they need to be brought into the decision-making process. I have 2 brief slides. I've been told to stop, but I'll tell you something. I was just in Algeria, and I heard a wonderful story. An Algerian delegation went to Switzerland, and the Swiss, they said, "You're 15 minutes late." And then the Algerian said, "Yes, you have the watch. we have the time. So I'm saying I have the time. Just 2 slides. Okay, so how are we going to go to address all these impacts? One of them is by making sure we have a leadership. At a very, very high level, we need leadership. Australia is maybe a role model in this because it made sure that both the opposition and the current government, together with the private sector and civil society, was a big part in this. When we have make sure there's leadership, we need to address all the climate change risk and opportunities. So make sure that all the data are put together, they're analyzed, and come up with strategies in order to do so. And then we need to prioritize and implement some responses. Monitor these responses and then go back to reassess. If you're going to go back with 4 messages from this presentation today, I want you to recall that we probably need to dial something. We need to diversify. That means we need economic diversification at all levels. We need to diversify at the household level. We need to diversify at economic level, at the national level. We need to integrate adaptation in all projects and everything we do. It's not ideal any longer to have standalone adaptation projects. It applies to all. In the Arab countries, we have been told throughout our consultation that it's both the rich and the poor and most sectors that will be impacted by climate change. And again, leadership, leadership, and leadership is called for in order to increase resilience to climate change in the Arab countries.